Good afternoon. Welcome to NCHV's quarterly webinar. This is our second year hosting the webinar series as folks are coming in. We have a good amount of attendees and they're coming in now. So this is our second year hosting the webinar series thanks to the generous support of the Home Depot Foundation. And this year our 2022 focus is on equity. Our first series focused on effectively including the voices of those with lived experience. It was a successful webinar and the attendees gained a lot of insight from our panelists. Today's webinar promises to be more of the same. Our focus today is on the housing needs of Native veterans. Over the last 10 years, significant progress has been made to reduce veteran homelessness nationwide. We've also developed a better understanding of where gaps persist for specific demographic groups over the same period. One thing that has become increasingly evident is that we must do a better job of applying equity throughout the entire homeless service system and in affordable housing development practices. We know that Native veterans who live on tribal and traditional lands have increasing housing needs. Identifying their housing challenges and aligning resources to meet their needs can be difficult due to several factors, including low visibility of homelessness, perceptions and understanding, and also geographic positioning. To help us navigate this issue, we're joined by two excellent panelists. Our panelists today are, sorry, let me pull up my slide, it's taking too long. You can see them on your screen as well, but our panelists today are we have Tony Walters, the Executive Director of the National American Indian Housing Council, and Diana Dede Devine, CEO and President of Native American Connections. We will have a time Q&A after their presentation, so please submit your questions to the chat function. And Dede, take it away, floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm assuming you're going to put up my slides. So yes, I'm coming to you from Phoenix, Arizona, and I'm worked for Native American Connections. I'm going on my 44th year, so it's been most of my life's work here at Native American Connections. We're a service provider, a human service, housing, and behavioral health medical provider. We were founded, we're celebrating our 50-year anniversary. You can go to the next slide, David, please. Our 50-year anniversary this year, and Phoenix was a relocation city, so many of you may know that, you know, a federal strategy to relocate Native American people in urban centers, predominantly around workforce, but many times they came to the communities and found themselves without housing, without, you know, an urban job skill in the community and social and cultural support of their tribal communities. So that's how we were founded in Phoenix. And so we really started as a healthcare provider, really behavioral health. This is our first residential substance use recovery program in the heart of downtown Phoenix with a sweat lodge right in the backyard, really focusing on men in recovery, and then from their voices was telling us that they needed safe, affordable places to live. So that's really how we began providing housing. Sober living and some of the other housing options was just really from the community itself and the people we were providing services to. Next slide. And so now today, fast forward 50 years, Native American Connections, we are the developer, the real estate developer, contractor, property manager, service provider of about 1,300 affordable and homeless housing units in the Phoenix area. And our target population still remains the Native American community. Our financing is generally through the low-income housing tax credit program, and then home and CDBG through our local municipalities, the county and the state, And so we serve all populations, but because of our behavioral health program being urban in a healthcare organization, we're able to really target and still majorly focus on the 120,000 Native American people that live in the Phoenix metropolitan area. And then on the housing side, we serve all populations, but still prioritize Native American people. Next slide. So this is the housing continuum that we offer. So we're one of the very few shelter providers for homeless youth age 18 to 26. And we're opening another 44-bed facility in the fall around November. And so we're going to be expanding those shelter beds. But when I say shelter, these are really transitional housing for homeless youth. And so engaging youth right from the streets and then giving them the life skills and the healthcare and the mental health services and then the job skills, educational attainment that they need to really transition into other stable housing situations. And then we run some of the motel shelters that sprang up during COVID. We run a shelter right in the heart of downtown Phoenix that really began when it initially opened, focusing on homeless Native American seniors that had comorbid health conditions for COVID. And then that shelter is still open today and still will continue until 2024. The sober living beds came developed, when people were transitioning out of our residential treatment centers. Again, people in recovery telling us that they needed safe, affordable places to live. And so we have several sober living facilities and beds. And then we operate transitional housing for youth that are coming out of the shelter. And that's a 30% youth pay no more than 30% of their income. These are youth as they attain the skills and everything that they need. And so really the youth can rent, this first time they probably had a lease and they're a tenant and they've got utilities in their names and they're building credit and they're just really learning how to be a, to be a tenant before they really have to go out into Phoenix in a market rate unit of some kind. We have over 120 residential substance use inpatient treatment beds, and they are utilized for people coming from the criminal justice system, for the jail, from psychiatric units, from hospital rooms. We have the local Phoenix Indian Medical Center is just blocks from our treatment centers. And so a variety of ways that people are entering into our residential treatment. And sometimes that's the real stabilization period and in which we're then sorting out a long-term housing plan for them. We have about 400 units of permanent supportive housing. I don't like to call it chronic homeless, but that's kind of the definition that is used to the prioritization tools and the scoring for homelessness. And I'm just I'll probably talk a little bit more about it later, but it's one of the issues that I think is a barrier sometimes for Native American people and for veterans. Out of those 400 units, 42 of them are specifically for veterans, anchored with VASH vouchers, but veterans are eligible for any of our units. It's just that those are specifically and only for veterans. We struggle. I think we have an outreach worker that really works to bring some of our veterans in off the street. We have a large VA hospital right next to many of our facilities too, and yet it really takes a cultural approach, I think, to really engage our veterans and make them feel comfortable, coming in and receiving services and then working on a permanent housing plan. We have senior housing units. We have about 700 affordable housing units, and these are just for working families, the low-income housing tax credit program. Families earning 40 to 60% area median income, and certainly veterans and families are eligible for all of our affordable housing. And we do have some market rate units that are mixed in with our affordable housing, just to, to demonstrate that our communities are of such quality that anyone would want to live there. And then we have a property in the middle of downtown Phoenix. It's 237 units. There's really no more affordability in downtown Phoenix. Rents are ranging at about $2,000 a month, and we have a lot of Native people that want to live and work and are homeless in that area. And so we're going to bring on almost 240 more units that that are affordable. About half of them have vouchers, and then half will be 30% of their income, 30, 40, and 50% of their income. Next slide, please. And then this is the youth shelter, just shows you the kind of the quality of the facility. And the one that says home base is the shelter, and then the other one with the little bed, that's actually the transitional living program. They're right next door to each other. So when our youth transition into their own apartment and into a lease, and certainly we have some young vets coming back that are really looking to connect, with other young people and other people that with their experience. This is a great place for them to re-enter, where they're paying no more than 30% of their income. Next slide, please. And then this is our property right on the Phoenix Mountain Preserve. Two sides of it are mountain preserve. So we're always looking to have locations that are easy to access, transportation corridors, close to work, but also, have that that kind of cultural support that they're looking for in terms of being close to the land, and sometimes not always easy in the heart of Phoenix. And so the picture, the white building is the residential treatment center, 50 beds there. And then the brown building, or where it looks more yellow on the other side, is 54 units of permanent supportive housing. And 42 of those 54 units or 32 of those units are anchored or specifically for vets with VASH vouchers. And that's a property that we really worked with the local VA to really try to outreach our local Native American vets so that they would have a permanent and safe place to live. Next slide, please. So in our residential treatment programs, we allow the family to stay together and for the children to come. That's pretty unusual when you're providing substance abuse treatment. It's usually just the individual, and it's sometimes in a hospital-based or psychiatric facility, and not real comfortable, where our residential SUD programs are really about healing and healing trauma and healing what's underneath the addiction. Not only the physical aspects, but the mental, social, spiritual aspects. And so many times just keeping that family intact, and if the children have been removed, working to have the children reunited with the family and give them the parenting. We use positive Indian parenting with our parents and children to really give them the skills they can as they're addressing their addiction and recovery. And sometimes it's just that role of being a mom or a dad. I know you just see pictures of women in here, but many times the fathers are coming in with their kids, and you see more and more fathers with custody of their children, really giving them the skills, the confidence, and the tools to reclaim their role as a mother and father. Next slide, please. And then we have another treatment center. It's called the Patina Wellness Center. It's 70 beds. And there is where we take couples, families, children. And at both sites, you can see the men's lodge, sweat lodge, and the women's sweat lodge. It's the talking circle room, and some of our traditional ceremonies and approaches to healing are really what anchor our treatment center. We're a medically licensed facility, but and we have to comply with all the policies, procedures, regulations, and everything. But the healing comes from best practice bases that have been practiced for really centuries. So next slide, please. And so these are two examples of permanent supportive housing for homeless individuals. Stepping Stone has 120 units anchored with HUD Continuum of Care SHIP dollars for some of the operating and services, predominantly services, and then some of the units that have project-based housing choice vouchers attached to the site. And then in Canto Point, the one on the top, that is in 54 units, and it is all project-based vouchers, 10 which are VASH, and then the other 44 are project-based vouchers. And so it makes it really easy when you have those vouchers attached to the project, because the person doesn't have to have the voucher in order to be housed, and it really speeds up the process of housing someone. I might just say here that Native American Connections has been able to work with our local continuum of care, HUD Continuum of Care, and the men's single coordinated entry lead contractor to have a Native coordinated entry, to be a Native American specialty coordinated entry site. So we have about 10,000 homeless people in Maricopa County from our last PIT count. About 5,000 were unsheltered and about 5,000 sheltered. So we have about 10,000 Native American people are disproportionately in that count of homelessness, making up about 2.5% of the county population, but nearing 7 to 8% of the homeless population. And very similar with the African American population, they make up only 9% of the county population, but 30% of the homeless population. And so our continuum of care agreed that we had racially biased structures and tools and prioritization and coordinated entry, and then we were able to then be designated as a specialty coordinated entry site where Native American people can come directly to Native American Connections, entering them into the HMIS system and then back into the coordinated care system. And then we have specialty case conferencing with our local COC as well, so that we're really trying to track, where our unsheltered, predominantly our unsheltered homeless natives and veterans are located, what kind of paperwork they need, how we can continue to provide that case management and navigate them into either our shelter, where they can stay while we're getting the paperwork done and improving their health care while they're there, and while they're doing the complicated process of trying to get into a permanent housing situation. Next slide, please. And then I just put these set-asides up here. I really don't like to talk to them like set-asides, but these are some of the set-asides in our low-income housing tax credit program and our qualified allocation plan. There are set-asides in home and SHIP funds and the Federal Home Loan Bank funds. So, it's because we're our own developer and contractor for our housing communities. NAC built those properties. So we're the owner, the developer, the contractor, the property manager, the service provider, and the compliance provider. Because we do all those things, we have layered financing that goes into the development of those properties, and they all have kind of some specialties set aside. And so I like to think that we serve people with that might have the most barriers to housing, whether that's income and whether that's some of the physical and mental health challenges or substance use, or even seniors, the population, the seriously mentally ill population, and certainly our veterans and those experiencing domestic violence. That's really who, we serve in our communities, and approaching them from that cultural perspective, I think, because we take such a strong perspective towards healing and spiritual healing and the culture of that we're providing some of the traditional ceremonies and practices, that all populations feel more comfortable when we take that approach to, you know, them defining, our relatives, our homeless relatives defining themselves, you know, what they want their housing experience to be like and what kind of additional services and wraparound supports they need. Next slide, please. But it does complicate, those set-asides do complicate the operations of our property, because the financing does direct those set-asides, and then you're, you know, you've kind of got a matrix of who can go into one unit. If I could remove that barrier, I would love to do that, so that people just present and you provide the level of housing service that they need. These are just some examples of our affordable housing communities. They're both in the heart of downtown Phoenix. Our rents start at about $500 a month. They're both about 2 blocks from our public transportation light rail system and the main bus hub for all of the Phoenix metropolitan area. And where the rents are about $2,000 around them, our rents start at $500 a month. And some people, sometimes they ask me if these are architectural renderings, because the buildings are so of such quality. And no, these are the actual facilities. So no matter what kind of housing needs somebody has, or what income level they are, or what kind of barriers they might experience, NAC, Native American Connections, has tried to have some kind of housing option for them. And people move back and forth along the kind of that continuum of housing need. Maybe they coming out of the prison system and they go into residential substance abuse treatment because they feel more comfortable getting services, and then entering into, maybe they get a job right away and then they are eligible for the affordable housing, or if they have other challenges that meet the homeless definitions. And again, the definitions you know, are somewhat limiting, but and they might go into our PSH, so they know they have a permanent place to live. During the pandemic, I think our residents, we have over 1,300 units, so we probably have about 4,000 residents. They didn't have to worry about being homeless. They had a safe place to be. We delivered about 20,000 meals a month. The kids had a place to go to school remotely when we had, you know, just virtual schools, and we made sure everybody had Wi-Fi access and hardware and learning how to do their software, and just all those interventions people needed to really feel safe and not have their housing threatened or their healthcare threatened during the pandemic. Next slide, please. I think I'm pretty close to the end of my slides. And then I just put this up there. We have a really cool parade every year. It's our 39th annual parade. We've got a parade every year that I've worked for Native American Connections, except for COVID. We didn't have one the last 2 years, so we're really excited. We actually have 30 events in September, October, November, with all the Native American organizations. We call it Native American Recognition Days, and the parade is one of the major events. And it takes about 2 hours to get all of our entries out onto the road, and it ends at the former Phoenix Indian School, which is another, we actually operate one of the historic elementary schools at the former Phoenix Indian School that was open for 99 years, from 1891 to 1990. And we have a gallery there where we tell, you know, the truthful history of the boarding school experience, and that's where the parade ends. And then we'll have an event there, kicking off a new video that we just found of the Phoenix Indian School marching band from the 1930s, and then there's a social powwow. So with our partner, the Phoenix Indian Center. Next slide. I think I'm done. So yeah, that's just a continuum of Native American Connections approach, cultural approach to housing Native American people, and then focusing on veterans.
Well, I'll jump in here. I don't know how I'm going to follow that, Dee Dee. That's great. That's great work that you guys are doing. I really love that you're on this with me. The focus on kind of the urban area in Phoenix there. definitely a different picture than what we might see in a reservation community and the needs there. So great that the audience today gets to see both those presentations. And like I said, the work you guys are doing, the buildings and the pictures you're sharing, I'm not sure I can compete with that. But I'll have a little bit to talk about on how we can also serve Native veterans, particularly in tribal communities. So my name is Tony Walters. I'm the Executive Director of the National American Indian Housing Council. We're based in Washington, D.C. We're a nonprofit that's comprised of tribal housing programs across the country, and those tribal programs are largely the ones focused within reservation communities themselves, and not necessarily always focused on the urban areas like we just heard about from Dee Dee. So glad you're getting both perspectives there. I'm a member of the Cherokee Nation from Oklahoma. I'm actually coming to you today from Oklahoma, a stop sign town called Hectorville, Oklahoma, south of Tulsa. So I appreciate being on here with you all. Appreciate NCHV's focus on tribal issues, always working with them to make sure we're adding the tribal perspective. Got to participate in their summer conference in DC a couple months ago. So always great to partner with NCHV. And I want to thank the audience too for just joining us today and being interested and engaged on these issues as well. So it takes all of us to solve some of these problems, and really look forward to everyone's questions answered, or questions, thoughts, concerns on how we can best serve tribal members across the country. We can jump to the next slide. So as I mentioned, NEIHC, based in Washington, D.C., founded 1974, so almost on our 50th anniversary, founded by the tribal housing programs, and that's our membership today. We've got about 300 tribal housing programs that serve about 450 to 500 of the tribal communities. There's 574 federally recognized tribes. Some of them get served through umbrella housing organizations. Membership can kind of go up or down each year just based on their needs and attention for their tribal communities. But one of the largest housing organizations, or representing most of the tribal housing programs across the country, will primarily do a lot of the advocacy work to help them connect them to resources and work with the federal government, federal agencies, and Congress. I've also do a lot of training and TA back to those programs as well as an organization. Next slide, please. So just want to give a quick snapshot, and some of these numbers are just numbers I pulled off of different kind of census sites and different things, but I just want to give folks kind of an overall awareness of what the universe of tribes and tribal veterans is across the country. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. They're located in probably 34 of the states, so not every state in the country has tribes still located within them. But Native Americans, of course, can be living all across the country, and many in urban areas. I think if you look at the percentage of natives actually living in tribal communities versus urban areas or metropolitan areas, it's actually about up to 70%. I've seen some statistics that say 70% of natives actually live outside of their tribal communities. So when you think of tribal communities and reservations, I know a lot of Native Americans are not living there. They have moved on to other areas or cities. I think Dee Dee mentioned it. There's been policies that encourage that, but a lot of times it's just markets as well, right? And business and job opportunities always more ripe in urban areas. That's the same for rural communities too. It's not just that's tribal communities that they're leaving, but just rural areas and moving into more populated or urban areas for jobs and education as well. But over the time, 170,000 Native American, Native Hawaiian veterans. I think many of you have heard historically Native Americans actually served in the military at higher rates per capita than other demographics. Certainly something that's been true for many years, and we've definitely heard the stories of different contributions that Natives have made to different wars and conflicts that the United States has been part of, World War I, World War II, and all the other wars as well. 29,000 active service members for American Indian, Alaska Native, and that adds in Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander as well. So a good healthy chunk of folks that we're here to serve, and we try to serve them wherever they want to be, or whether they want to return to their tribal communities after their service, or they are going back to urban areas to work or to continue education, or just live in urban areas. We want to continue to serve them wherever they want to kind of spend their time and lives. So it takes all of us to kind of provide those services, and I'm happy to have a conversation here. We'll go to the next slide. Native veteran homelessness statistics, very hard to track. I think we've seen different metrics. I think from working with NCHV over time, a lot of the homelessness statistics sometimes don't even include Native Americans as a subset, just because it is such a sparse population for any one given area. So only making up 2 to 3% of the entire U.S. population. And you talk about how that's spread out over all these different tribal communities and urban areas. Some cities and locations, that population could be even lower than the 2 or 3%. So it's very hard to count and track. And homelessness in Indian country and tribal communities does look different. We talk about overcrowded homes rather than kind of homelessness that we would see on the streets in urban areas. A lot of tribal communities are just going to have overcrowded homes with families taking in relatives, friends. You can have 2 to 3 generations living under the same roof in a tribal community as well. So a lot of those issues probably mask more homelessness than you might think of or see in other areas. So it probably is likely undercounted or uncounted in some of our tribal communities. But some of the rates that we do have do show that Native Americans do suffer from homelessness, higher rates than other demographics as well. And particularly when you do get to homelessness in the urban areas, you're starting to get outside of where folks are aware of it, and the veterans themselves and Native Americans who are affected by homelessness may not know where to turn, because a lot of the tribal programs, a lot of tribes have both housing programs, they'll have veterans departments as well, but they may not have funding or bandwidth to really serve anyone outside their tribal community. So once folks do move into urban areas, you do start to see gaps, and it's great to see organizations like DD who have flourished in that space and really providing great services to Native Americans and veterans in some of our urban areas. And there's different groups across the country. We were just in Seattle for our annual conference earlier this spring, the Chief Seattle Club, another group up there that's really serving natives and Native veterans and homelessness issues up there in the Seattle area. You can jump to the next slide. So when we talk about housing at all for tribal communities, the first place we think about are the tribal housing programs that I mentioned. As I said, there's 574 tribes. Most of them have a housing program themselves, or they're part of a kind of an umbrella group, particularly in Alaska. A lot of those tribal communities are grouped into regional corporations, regional associations for housing. So a lot of, one of those organizations could serve, anywhere between 10, 20, 30, even 50 smaller tribes within that area. Primary funding for those programs, for those tribal housing programs, is the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act. You may have heard the word NAHASDA. When we think about tribal housing, NAHASDA is the largest federal funding program that comes out of HUD. It's a block grant each year that's appropriated by Congress. It's currently at $770 million, which sounds like a good chunk of money. You'd think, though, you spread that out over 574 reservation communities, and you can see how that gets spread thin very quickly. A long time, that program has actually been stuck even lower funding at 650 for the nearly 20 years since it was created in 1997. So a lot of flat funding for the program, which actually, as we all know, leads to cuts over time. When you factor in inflation, tribes are actually only working with maybe 75% or so of the funding that they originally were receiving under NAHASDA. We're asking tribes to do a lot of things with this funding. It's not specific to homelessness. It's specific to Native veterans. Tribal housing programs are doing rental assistance. They're the ones spurring new construction, new housing units in their communities. They're creating home ownership programs for their members. Elder housing, student housing, supportive housing, any type of housing service you can think of. A tribal housing program is the one tasked to, usually the primary organization tasked to carry that out. And they're usually basically getting just their annual formula fund under NAHASDA. Some of those tribes, less than 100,000, 150, 200,000 to really operate a program. So as you can see, that's probably paying for 1 or 2 key staff, and then those staff are then scrambling to find other resources to actually put out housing services or construct new homes in the area. So stretched thin across Indian country through our primary housing programs, as you can see. Next slide, please. One program that is specific to Native veterans is the Tribal HUD-VASH program. Dee Dee mentioned a little bit in the context of working in the Phoenix area. This is a nationwide program created almost 15 years ago. Wasn't reaching tribal communities because it is a voucher-based program, and tribal housing programs haven't been utilizing those. And in some cases, they've been barred from using those programs because there's a specific NAHASDA program or NAHASDA funding. But we did create, groups of tribes advocated for tribal set-asides to the HUD-VASH program starting, and it started in January of 2015, getting some vouchers back to tribes so they can actually serve veterans within their community. One of the issues that we see with HUD-VASH is because it does blend supportive housing and services from the VA. A lot of those veterans would have to kind of go and find housing kind of nearby VA facilities and take care there. Where like I said at the beginning, we try to do what we can to make sure Native Americans and veterans in particular can go where they want to live. If they want to go back to their residence,
Did you want the air conditioner?
as well. The tribal HUD-VASH program, though, is still limited to just a handful of tribes. Out of the 570 odd tribal communities, only about 26 to 30 now are involved in the tribal HUD-VASH program, and the funding levels have varied year to year. But there's, some tribes are doing very great with the funding they get through HUD-VASH and supplying housing opportunities to those veterans. There are housing stock issues. One of the studies that we cite the most from 2017 now, so it's getting a little old, but HUD did a study that had a needs assessment for all of Indian country. It said 68,000 housing units are needed across the country. So, over 100 units per tribe, essentially. Certainly a housing shortage across the country, and in rural areas and tribal areas are no different. So that's a big obstacle for housing folks within the tribal communities, is just the overall housing stock limitations. And then, as I mentioned, the VA supportive services availability, getting veterans the care they need at the same time as they're in part of that HUD-VASH program. HUD is trying to expand this both administratively, and we're trying to expand it legislatively to make sure all tribes are eligible and included in HUD-VASH, and that they have the resources available to them. Next slide, please. Another program that we see used a lot in tribal communities and veterans is the VA Native American Direct Loan Program. This is a homeownership program, of course, meant for tribal communities specifically, but it's a very small program at the VA. They only have a handful of full-time employees to really operate that program and do the marketing. There are years where we've only seen 20 to 30 loans, home loans, come out of this VA direct loan program. So you can see that's not a great volume for the number of tribal communities across the country. It does require some tribal government interaction as well. We know only 100 tribes or so, a little over 100 tribes have entered into the MOUs that are needed with the VA to carry out this program in their community. So a lot of improvement can be made there as well. But I will say, we've seen Native veterans, and we've heard stories from tribes where Native veterans have gone from that full spectrum of, having needs, facing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, getting help through HUD-VASH, and then the tribe helping them along that path to where they're now eligible or have even taken advantage of programs like the Native American Direct Loan Program. So moving folks, from that state of homelessness or at risk of it all the way into home ownership over the last 5 or 10 years through these types of programs. So great to hear those success stories, and obviously we want to make sure those can happen all across Indian country throughout the United States. Next slide, please. So what does NEIHC do in this space, and what can we help you guys engage with as well? But one thing we always do is advocate for expansion of federal programs that are both national or regional, but we want to make sure that the tribes in that region or across the country are eligible for these types of programs. HUD-VASH being a prime example. We worked 10 years ago to get the tribes involved in HUD-VASH to a greater degree, and now that that's happened, we want to try to make that permanent and make it expand to all tribes. There is legislation out there that we're advocating for, and part of bills that would do that. So we advocate for that year to year, and hope to see something about that pass this the last tail end of this Congress. That's
Native American veterans.
Part of the reauthorization as well. And then just other efforts to expand programs, whether it's HUD-VASH, whether it's administratively or legislatively, that we are expanding
He's like
to all the country in improving both
American
NADL. So recently been a program and trying to make sure tribes are aware of that, how they can get involved into continuing care that are either pre-existing, or if they're not involved in existing COCs, how they can start accessing some of that funding from HUD directly themselves. And then again, we provide a lot of training and TA back to these programs so they can learn how to connect all these dots and learn how to put these pieces together. As Dee Dee mentioned, it's a lot of layering, financing from all sorts of sources, and our job is to make sure that the tribal housing programs have all the tools they need to put those pieces together and develop these housing opportunities for their communities as well. Next slide, please. I will say, and Dee Dee was a prime example of the work going on in urban areas. Because our organization is comprised of the tribal housing programs, not very many of them are really reaching tribal urban areas. We've seen a trend in recent years where more and more tribal housing programs are learning how to better serve their members who may be in nearby urban areas, but a lot of their focus and limited funding is still focused on the tribal reservations and communities themselves. The urban Indian homelessness issue is harder to reach subgroup because they are kind of divorced away from the tribal area, so they're not getting served or know where to go to receive tribal services in all respects. And then they may not trust or know which organizations within the urban area to go to. And the urban organizations themselves that are non-native traditionally may not know, how to best interact or engage, or may not even know how to market their services to this kind of subgroup of Native Americans affected by homelessness in urban areas. There are several urban Indian organizations across the country. You can jump to the next slide. Might be a little blurry. I think I took a screenshot, but the next slide will show different regions across the country and urban Indian organizations that serve them. You can see Phoenix has a handful, Portland, California, anywhere in the country, there's going to be some type of organization that can help you engage with the Native Americans in your community. So certainly encourage all of you to reach out to these groups. If you see them listed in your area, this is a great place to start. Actually see Native American Connections on the list there for Phoenix. So you can certainly see groups like hers exist all across the country to serve this kind of smaller population, not very small for Native Americans, because as I mentioned, a lot of Native Americans live in these urban areas, but it's kind of a invisible population. To some respect, when people think of Native Americans, you almost always think of tribal communities, not really realizing the size of the population kind of in your own communities in urban and metropolitan areas. Next slide, please. So I think the next slide talks about just kind of how you can better engage with tribal communities as well. And my biggest takeaway for this is just to be proactive in that engagement. Work with tribal housing programs, work with tribal veteran departments in your geography, in your regions, and just learn what services they are. Information sharing is vital, right? So if they may not be aware of the size of the population that you may be seeing come through some of your organization's doors asking for help, and the tribe may not be aware. And once you kind of bridge those connections, you can certainly start just creating a better overall service environment for this subgroup of Native American veterans anywhere in the country. Recognize that tribal members are almost always eligible for non-tribal programs. We see this all the time, where when someone learns that someone is a Native American, they think, well, someone else can take care of that, or that's a service that someone else provides and not me. If you're looking at more general grants and funding streams, Native Americans, no different than anyone else in the country in regards to citizenship, anything like that, eligibility. So if you're working in more general programs, Native Americans are almost always eligible for these services. So don't overlook them. Don't think that someone else is necessarily taking up that piece of service that can be provided. If anything, it's an additional layer of service that Native Americans can benefit from, in the sense that they have a tribe or a home community that they can always go back to. But certainly when they're not in those tribal communities, we want to make sure that they're getting as many services as anyone else could expect to see in those areas. And then engage with us at NAIHC. So we do annual conventions each year. We can provide those connections to any of the organizations on this call, or attendees on this call. Want to work and want to engage with tribes, we can get you contact information. We can just expose all of you to what the issues are for tribal communities and housing, homelessness issues. We try to do training and TA on supportive housing, and do a lot of cohort type groups where we find a successful tribe that's got a good model. We'll try to involve other tribes to come in and learn about it over time, and have more and more dedicated training and TA for that to be replicated. If there are good models that you all are seeing, especially in rural spaces, would love to hear from you on how we can engage or include tribes within tribal specifics, but always encourage everyone just to be more proactive. A lot of times Native American communities just seem invisible because there are always other groups that you think maybe certainly would encourage all of you to be proactive in that engagement, and to some extent be tenacious. I've learned in my time at NAIHC and in my 10 or 15 years just working with tribal issues, capacity is bandwidth. As you know, 574 tribes and governments and housing programs. bandwidth of what all they can do is severely limited. So if you want to engage with tribes, be respectful, be present, and be proactive. But just I would say, be tenacious as well. A lot of times tribes may think, that may not be worth the effort. I've got enough on my plate. But if you guys are really interested in serving and engaging with tribes, certainly encourage you to kind of be proactive and tenacious in that, and just make sure the tribes are aware that you are there to be a partner and coordinate with their programs and to serve that community and in the best degree that we all can. So that's kind of the advice that I would give to folks on this call, and continue working with veterans in rural and tribal communities is to just be as proactive as you can. We want to make sure every veteran, every individual, Native or otherwise, is being served with respect to homelessness issues, and getting them out of those conditions and into better states and housing opportunities. So that's kind of the big takeaway. I think the last slide, just the one picture I have. I didn't have as many great pictures as Dee. We don't work on specific projects like that. So, but here where we do have our events, we almost always try to engage our local Native veterans wherever we are, for color guards, things like that at our events. So I just wanted to share that picture here at the end. And so that'll wind up my comments. I think I'll turn it back over to David. I think we're probably going to move into a Q&A. Happy to answer any questions you guys might have.
Oh, I'm back. Thank you, Tony and Dee, for some great presentations and great information that you shared with everybody today. Is just wonderful to have you guys on, and to get your expertise on this issue that is necessary for our service providers as we try to be more equitable in our work. We have a couple of questions for the audience, from the audience. We'll answer. You guys can answer those before we get out of here. The first one, and this is for this first one is for Dee, I believe. Let me pull it up. The question asks, what other states are you in, or are you looking to be in? Is your organization developing in any other states, or possibly, yeah.
So we're pretty concentrated right here in the Phoenix area. We have I mentioned 120,000 Native American people living in the Phoenix metropolitan area. We are working with tribes and some of the, I'm just going to say, border towns, and trying to address Native American homelessness across Arizona, but we haven't worked outside. And I think Tony said too, we are interested in working with tribes. There are some, like in Minneapolis, and place where tribes are really working with the urban providers and providing homelessness and investing off reservation. That hasn't really happened in Arizona yet, but I think that's going to be happening, and more opportunity. We're really utilizing those non-tribal resources to serve tribal members, so I think there's a lot to learn about the leverage financing that we utilize that tribes can have the same access to. And so I think I'm hoping there's going to be partnership. On the healthcare side, on our residential treatment, we take referrals from across the country, tribes that don't have residential substance abuse treatment. We have contracts in Alaska and South Dakota and lots of different places. So there, it's a much wider reach, but on housing, we pretty still focused here in Arizona.
Thank you for the answer, Dee. Another question we have is this. I'll give this one to Tony, but Dee could answer afterwards. For organizations that have not yet partnered with local tribal organizations in a meaningful way, what type of cultural humility do you recommend in terms of behavior and approach to get partnerships started off on the right foot?
Well, I think the biggest thing is just come with a tone of respect, right? And wanting to serve that community. I think doing education for what that community's history has been. Each tribe is unique and different, right? So you want to learn about their history. You don't just want to approach any one tribe with a general understanding of tribal issues or national data sets. So we know there's these issues affect Native Americans. Try to do a little research on what the specific tribe you're wanting to engage with is. Are they there in their traditional homelands? Have they been moved? A lot of tribes across the country have been moved to different parts where they are now reside. So, just do a little bit of that research and learning, know their story. So when you're going there, you'll have that it's no longer a perception of interest, right? You're actively engaged and want to be helpful to that community, and they'll pick up on that. I know when tribes are looking, as I mentioned, they may get 4 or 5 groups wanting to come to a tribe and saying we want to help and we have the service. A lot of tribes may just kind of push it off to the side, saying we don't have time for that. But if you kind of put in that legwork and know a tribal community's history and story, they're going to pick up on that and say, well, that's the group I want to partner with moving forward. So certainly just kind of humility, respect, but doing that kind of upfront work to learn about the community itself as well.
Oh, thank you for that great answer, Tony. Dee Dee, anything to add to that, or?
Well, I probably would have said many of the same things. Thank you, Tony. The only thing I would say is, a lot of people want the introduction and they just think it's, you're going to introduce them and they're going to be able to, it takes a long time. And I would say, look at your own staff. How are you sensitizing your own staff? Are you hiring Native American people? If you want to have relationships and business with tribal communities, look at your internally beginning to what your own employees look like. It's going to take some time. It's going to be respectful. And then I would just say it's a shifting environment where a lot of people, I'm going to say research and businesses are coming in and they say, we have this to offer you. We're going to give this to you. And really it's going in and listening and saying, let the community say what their needs are, what their problems are, their solutions, and you should be the listener, not coming in with a product you want to sell to them.
Thank you for that, Dee Dee. There's some great points there. Specifically to veterans, have you seen a difference in veteran outcomes, whether it's data or anecdotally, since you switched to having special Native coordinated entry?
So I'm going to say Native people weren't even getting to that point. We use the SPDAT tool. It's not kind of a, in our community, we consider it a racially biased tool. They were unsheltered. And so in our system to get housing, you had to go into the shelters, you had to get SPDATed, you had to, there's all these processes, and they were unsheltered, not trusting the large places and not wanting to go through that assessment process. And so that the coordinated entry, I think, is more been, it's not so much on the success of the outcome, it's actually getting people housed. And then the success comes from those wraparound supportive services where you're listening to the community in which you're serving, what kind of services they need. But the coordinated entry was really, I think, has made a change. We've actually seen a little bit of a drop of the overrepresentation of Native homeless, just because we're getting people into permanent supportive housing.
Thank you for that. Anything to add, Tony?
Well, I wouldn't add anything specific to that issue. I think across the board we see that where people come up with these on an equity discussion. Are tribes getting involved in some of these very specific issues, and are they being impacted? I would argue that a lot of times tribes aren't even involved in those kind of issues enough to be impacted by the specifics. I work on the housing side, and I'm not specific to veterans. We're talking about appraisal bias and home ownership, things like that, mortgage denials. Native Americans, sure, they suffer from that probably at a disproportionate rate, but that's not even the big issue, right? It's just getting involved and engaged in some of these housing discussions generally first before you can even really approach some of these very specific issues. But there's a general trend across the board, across tribal issue areas, and not just homelessness or veterans or housing, but that's been the trend that everything is improving over time. We're getting so much more education and awareness. So yeah, I would say things are improving.
Oh, thank you. I think we have time for one more. If we're not aware of the housing gaps Native veterans face, what are the best ways to partner with tribal or urban Indian organizations to close the gaps? In your knowledge, what do you guys think?
Well, I'll jump in first, and Dee Dee might even have more specific answers. But for us, it's just kind of inviting yourself and getting involved in some of the meetings that they have. We have our national conventions, but there are 7 or 8 regional housing associations as well that are more localized geographically. So there's in the Southwest, for instance, New Mexico and Arizona tribes form the Southwest Tribal Housing Alliance. So find out when those meetings are, reach out to them and say, hey, I'd love to come learn about the issues affecting tribes in this community. So each of your communities, for any of our attendees, will have a group like that. urban Indian organizations I showed on the chart. So just reaching out to some of those groups and introducing yourself and saying, we want to learn what your issues are, and here's some of the services that we can help provide, once if they're good fits for you.
And I guess just the only thing I would add is I'll give some credit to our HUD Continuum of Care, Maricopa County HUD Continuum of Care, on our data subcommittee. And they were willing to really look at the racial equity data, that, the overrepresentation of BIPOC communities. And that led to us having some of the specialty coordinated entry and really looking at a system where BIPOC communities were not getting permanent housing, and when they were getting a solution, it was a failed solution. Many of them were getting a rapid voucher that when expired, they returned to homelessness. So I think I'm just going to give them credit. When they were willing to really dig in and look at the data, it gave us, that picture that doesn't lie, that we've got to change some things in our community. So it took some other people to be interested in making change in our community, and that was kind of the beginning that we could use that data to start making some other changes.
Oh, thank you both. Thank you so much. I would say thank you everybody for joining us today for the webinar. Thank you so much to the Home Depot Foundation that sponsors these quarterly webinars. Please, everybody, look out in your emails for the video and slides from today and for our next webinar series coming up soon. Thank you so much to Tony and Dee Dee for joining us and providing us with the insight and expertise that can help us out in the field and to just be better at our jobs and improve. We really appreciate that so much. Thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of the afternoon.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.